It happened on an ordinary night inside a soundproofed vocal booth outside Cologne, Germany, in the fall of 1981. Klaus Meine took a breath, reached for a note he had sung 1,000 times before, and instead felt something tear deep inside his own throat. Blood. Silence. The album that was supposed to make the Scorpions superstars in America sat half-finished on the tape reels behind the glass, and in that instant, nobody in the room knew if their singer would ever hit a high note again. Producer Dieter Dierks froze at the mixing desk, watching through the glass as Klaus doubled over and grabbed the microphone stand for balance. The other band members, waiting in the lounge down the hall, heard the sudden silence where a soaring vocal should have been, and something in that silence told them to run. What happened over the next several months would decide not just the fate of one album, but whether Klaus Meine would ever sing another word for the rest of his life. It would push a German rock band to the edge of everything they had spent over a decade building, and force them to gamble it all on a surgeon's steady hands. To understand why that torn throat mattered so much, you have to go back more than a decade, to a teenager named Klaus Meine, walking into a Hannover rehearsal room in 1969 and joining a scrappy young band called the Scorpions. His voice was raw and soaring, a tenor that could cut through Rudolf Schenker's guitar like a blade through fog. And from that first rehearsal, Rudolf knew he had found something rare. Through the 70s, the band clawed their way up from smoky beer halls and package tours, opening for bigger names, album by album, riff by riff, refusing to stay just another German rock band nobody outside their own country had heard of. By 1979, with the album Love Drive, and again in 1980 with Animal Magnetism, something started to shift. American radio stations were finally saying their name correctly on air. Record executives who once ignored their calls were suddenly returning them within the hour. Crowds in cities like Los Angeles and Chicago were showing up to shows already knowing the words. After years of grinding tours across Europe and Japan, sleeping on buses and playing to half-empty rooms, the band could finally see the door to real American stardom cracked open in front of them. This next album could not simply be good. It had to be the one that kicked that door wide open, the breakthrough they had chased since Klaus was still a teenager with nothing but a dream. So in 1981, the Scorpions booked into Dierks' studio just outside Cologne, with producer Dieter Dierks, the man who had shaped their sound since the mid-70s and understood exactly what this album, later titled Blackout, needed to become. Rudolf Schenker and guitarist Matthias Jabs spent long hours sharpening riffs until they cut like steel. Drummer Herman Rarebell and bassist Francis Buchholz locked into a rhythm section built for stadiums that didn't exist yet on their tour schedule. And night after night, Klaus Meine climbed into that vocal booth and sang harder than he had ever sung in his life, pushing his voice into a register meant for arenas the band could still only imagine. Take after take, he chased the exact sound in his head, the one he believed would finally translate everything the Scorpions were onto American radio. Nobody around him stopped to ask what that pace was doing to his throat, because there simply wasn't time to ask. A deadline loomed. A record label waited impatiently for finished tapes, and a band that had spent 12 hard years earning this one shot had no intention of missing it over something as ordinary as a sore throat. Klaus pushed through fatigue that would have stopped most singers cold, convinced that whatever ache he felt in the morning would fade by the following afternoon, the way it always had before. The warning signs had actually started weeks earlier, quiet enough that Klaus could talk himself out of worrying about them. His voice tired faster than it used to, a rasp creeping in by the third song of any session instead of the 8th or 9th. A soreness that once faded overnight now lingered stubbornly into the next afternoon, sitting at the back of his throat like a low, dull warning. He drank warm tea between takes. He rested his voice whenever the schedule allowed it, which wasn't often. He told himself it was nothing new, that every singer who had ever fronted a rock band got hoarse from time to time, that this was simply the cost of doing the job at the level it demanded. He kept going, because in his mind, stopping was never actually an option on the table. The band was counting on him. The songs, sitting half-finished on tape, were counting on him. Somewhere across the Atlantic, an American audience the Scorpions had spent a decade trying to reach was waiting too, and Klaus had no intention of being the reason they never got the chance to hear this record. So he swallowed the pain, cleared his throat between takes, and told Dieter Dierks he was fine every single time he was asked, even as the rasp crept a little further into his lower register with each passing week, an early signal that something inside his throat was breaking down far more seriously than ordinary fatigue ever could. Then came the night everything finally gave way. Klaus stepped into the booth to lay down a lead vocal for one of the album's key tracks, adjusted his headphones the way he always did, and nodded through the glass that he was ready. He took a breath and pushed for a note he had hit cleanly 100 times before in rehearsal. Instead of sound, there was a tearing sensation deep inside his throat, sharp enough to make him gasp and grab the microphone stand just to stay upright. He tasted blood at the back of his mouth. The note never came out at all. On the other side of the glass, Dieter Dierks watched his singer double over in real time, one hand pressed against his own throat, and understood immediately this was not ordinary hoarseness catching up with him. This was something breaking, right there in front of everyone, in the middle of a session that was supposed to finish a chorus, not end a man's ability to sing. Rudolf Schenker rushed in from the control room the moment he heard the commotion, and found Klaus pale, shaking, unable to speak above a whisper. For a band that had built an entire identity, an entire decade of hard-won momentum around that unmistakable soaring tenor, the sight of their singer unable to produce even a single clean note was more frightening than any bad review or canceled tour date they had ever faced. The session ended immediately. Someone called a doctor, and the studio, usually alive with music late into the night, went completely, terribly silent. The doctors in Germany delivered their diagnosis carefully, the way doctors deliver news they already know will devastate someone. Klaus Meine had hemorrhaged his vocal cords, damaging them severely enough that continued singing could cause permanent, irreversible harm. There was talk of ruptured tissue, of scar formation, of a voice that might never again produce the sound that had defined the Scorpions for over a decade. One specialist was blunt with him. If Klaus kept singing the way he had been pushing himself, he risked losing his voice entirely, not just for this one album, but forever. For a band built almost entirely around that unmistakable wailing tenor, the words landed like a death sentence delivered in a quiet examination room. Rudolf Schenker remembers sitting with Klaus in the days that followed, watching his closest friend go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with his damaged throat. Klaus wasn't just afraid of losing an album, or a tour, or a shot at America. He was afraid of losing the one thing that had defined who he was since he was a teenager in Hannover dreaming of exactly this life. Singing was never just a job to him. It was identity. It was purpose. Now that dream carried a very real chance of ending in silence, mid-sentence, with half a masterpiece sitting unfinished on a shelf in Cologne, and no promise it would ever be completed by the man who started it. The band now faced an impossible choice, one none of them had ever imagined having to make. They could shelve Blackout indefinitely and simply wait, with no doctor able to promise that waiting would actually fix anything at all. They could quietly consider replacing Klaus, a brutal thought none of them wanted to say out loud, but one that circled the room anyway whenever a label's money and 12 years of momentum were sitting on the line. Or they could gamble everything on a far riskier path, a specialized throat surgery that carried no guarantee of success and every real possibility of making things permanently worse. Rudolph refused to accept a future for this band without Klaus Meine's voice fronting it. So the search began for someone who might actually be able to save it. That search led the band across the Atlantic, to Los Angeles, and to a renowned laryngologist named Dr. Hans von Lieden, a specialist whose name was quietly passed among singers and performers desperate enough to fly halfway around the world for one man's steady hands. Von Lieden had treated opera singers and film actors, voices the world considered irreplaceable, and he agreed to examine Klaus as soon as the band could get him on a plane. He confirmed exactly what the German doctors had feared. The vocal cords were severely damaged. Surgery was possible, but success was not promised. There was a real chance that even a technically successful operation would leave Klaus's voice permanently changed, robbed of the power and range that had carried songs like Still Loving You and The Zoo across Europe's biggest stages. Klaus lay in a Los Angeles hospital bed the night before the operation, staring at a ceiling he couldn't really see through the fear clouding his thoughts. Rudolph sat beside him for hours, having flown out with him rather than let him face this alone. They didn't talk about riffs or record deals or the tapes waiting back in Cologne. They talked about friendship, about the years since 1969, about whether any of it would matter if Klaus woke up from surgery unable to sing at all. Klaus later admitted he made a kind of peace with himself that night. If this truly was the end of his voice, he wanted to know he had tried absolutely everything to save it, rather than spend the rest of his life wondering what might have happened if he had simply let the doctors try. The surgery itself the next morning was delicate, almost beyond description. A procedure performed on tissue thinner than paper, vibrating thousands of times every single second, responsible for every scream, every whisper, every note that had ever made an audience of thousands go completely silent. Von Lieden worked with total precision, removing damaged tissue while trying desperately to preserve every fiber that gave Klaus's voice its instantly recognizable character. There was no test run beforehand. There was no second attempt available if something went wrong under those lights. When Klaus finally woke up in recovery, his throat wrapped and aching, the only certainty in the room was silence. He was ordered not to speak, not even in the faintest whisper, for weeks, and told that anything less than total silence could undo whatever the surgery had just accomplished. What followed was the strangest chapter of Klaus Meine's entire life. The man whose voice had filled arenas across 2 continents now communicated entirely through handwritten notes passed to bandmates, nurses, and eventually to his own worried family back home. He wrote down jokes to keep the mood light. He wrote down fears he could never have said out loud, even if he were allowed to speak. More than once, he wrote the exact same question over and over on a fresh page, not knowing if anyone could actually answer it. Would he ever sing again? Or had Blackout just quietly become the album that ended his career instead of launching it into America? Rudolph visited constantly during those weeks, reading Klaus's notes aloud in the hospital room, trying to keep his friend's spirit from collapsing under all that enforced silence. The recovery stretched on with agonizing slowness. A full month of not speaking at all gave way to cautious, closely supervised vocal therapy, where Klaus wasn't even allowed to sing so much as hum, testing fragile new tissue with the gentlest sounds a human throat can make. Every single session became a small experiment in hope and terror all at once. Could he sustain a note without pain? Did it crack halfway through? Did it hurt more today than yesterday? He worked with a vocal coach the way an injured athlete works back from a shattered joint, one careful repetition at a time, celebrating tiny victories that would have meant absolutely nothing to him a year earlier. A single clean middle register note, held steady for even a few seconds, now felt to him like an outright miracle. Back in Germany, the rest of the Scorpions waited without a finished album, and without any real certainty their singer was ever coming back to finish it. Dieter Dierks kept the studio ready, tapes cued, refusing to let the sessions go cold. Rudolph kept writing new material in the meantime, refusing to plan for any version of this band that didn't include Klaus standing at that microphone. Then, months after the surgery, a phone call finally came through to the studio. Klaus wanted to try recording again. Nobody promised it would work. Nobody dared say out loud how much was riding on the next few hours inside that booth. He stepped back into the vocal booth quieter than before, almost cautious, a man carefully reintroducing himself to his own instrument after months of forced silence. The first takes were tentative, testing, deliberately careful not to push too hard, too fast, exactly as his doctors and vocal coach had instructed. But something remarkable happened as the hours passed that day. The power slowly returned, and with it came something new. A slightly different texture in the higher register, a little more battle-tested and honest than the old voice had ever been. When Klaus finally nailed the soaring chorus of "No One Like You" in one confident take, the entire control room went silent for a completely different reason this time. Dieter Dierks reportedly had tears in his eyes. Rudolf Schenker has since said it was one of the most emotional moments of his entire career, watching his closest friend's voice come back from what doctors had once called a real possibility of permanent silence. Blackout was finally released in March of 1982, and "No One Like You" became the song that broke the Scorpions wide open in the United States, climbing American rock radio in a way none of their earlier singles had ever managed. The album that had almost ended with a surgeon's scalpel instead became the launching pad for everything that followed, the sold-out American arenas, the momentum that carried straight into Love at First Sting 2 years later, the global stardom that a German band from Hannover had chased since the mid-1960s. Almost nobody standing in those crowds, screaming along to every word of "No One Like You," ever knew how close that voice had come to vanishing forever inside a Los Angeles hospital room. Decades later, Klaus Meine still credits that surgery and the terrifying gamble surrounding it as the true turning point of his entire career, the moment he finally understood exactly what his voice meant to him and exactly what he was willing to risk in order to keep it. Every scream on every Scorpions record made since 1982 carries a small trace of that silence inside it. The silence of a man who once genuinely wondered if he would ever sing again, and who chose to fight for the answer instead of quietly accepting silence as the end of his story.